Good morning, everyone. My name is Kadri Liik. I am Senior Policy Fellow with European Council on Foreign Relations, but most of you probably remember me here in a somewhat different role. I must say it's actually enjoyable to be at Lennart Meri conference as a guest. For the first time in my life, I actually have time to listen to the sessions, and they turn out to be interesting. My task today is to take us through the Russia session. We already had a debate whether Russia has been upgraded or downgraded by moving a session from evening to morning. It's not an upgrade, it's neither downgrade. It has to do with plane traffic in the world. Lisa said missed her connection yesterday, and so in order to later take advantage of her, we decided to switch the panels. We have four excellent speakers to take us through Russia. Boris Nemtsov, former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, now one of the opposition leaders. We have James Sherr, who is a Senior Fellow with Chatham House. We have Eckart von Klaeden, who is Minister of State in the Federal Chancellery and member of Bundestag. It's a long title, but he's one of the smartest people on Russia in Germany. And David Kramer, President of Freedom House. And we will be looking for the sources of Russian foreign policy. Why does Russia behave the way it does? And I suggest we start with James. Will you, in just 5 or 7 minutes, give us some overall analytical framework, and then we can discuss it from more regional perspectives?
I'll compromise. I'll aim at 6 minutes. By the way, I'm an associate fellow of Chatham House now, which means I will have more time to come to Lennart Meri conferences than I did in the past. The principle and overarching aim of Russian foreign policy is to create the conditions abroad that are conducive to the maintenance of a system of governance at home. And that is my first point. This means that no alternative model should be allowed to take root on Russia's doorstep. It means that not only will Russia support a multipolar world, but in Sergei Lavrov's words, a world of multiple values centers, and they want this type of world to be accepted by all other actors as legitimate and a principle of international order. Russia might not benefit economically from the Eurozone crisis, but it is of considerable benefit in political, geopolitical, and psychological terms. Secondly, the Russians perceive correctly that Europe today is divided into different normative jurisdictions. The European Union is a universe not only of states and institutions, but practices, normative standards, rights, values, and definitions of best practice which are rooted in the way economies function, legal systems function, and in business cultures. And the Russian and post-Soviet system is in notable, significant, and in some respects fundamental ways different from this. The existential problem is created by the fact that the EU de facto is proposing further expansion, not in the form of new membership, but association agreements which confer the responsibility on new states to incorporate a significant proportion of the acquis communautaire and extend in exchange some significant proportion of the de facto prerogatives and privileges of memberships. And that situation and that contest has given momentum and aggressiveness to what has already existed. Russia's own countervailing integration projects, the Eurasian Customs Union, now the Eurasian Union, and even Russia's own attempt in places like Transnistria to mimic the creation of Euro regions with an alternative. My third point is that although what I've just described represents, in the mindset of the Kremlin and much of the elite, an existential threat. It's not a temporal one. The Russians can see that the West's principal priorities are different. They are not about Russia, that we are managing these priorities poorly. And as you could see from the aftermath of John Kerry's meeting with President Putin over Syria, and the Russian decision within 48 hours to announce publicly the sending of the S-300 missiles, that, in their view, the Obama administration lacks fiber and seriousness. My final point is that in the absence of a patron, as far as the Kremlin is concerned, Russia's neighbors count for nothing. This is why there is a policy today of subtle pressures, nothing overt, nothing provocative with respect to Transnistria, Ukraine, and Georgia. But if the Vilnius summit of the Eastern Partnership in November does lead to the signing of association agreements, I think these calculations can change. Just as MAP was regarded by Russians as tantamount to NATO membership and an inevitable step towards it, in their mindset also association agreements are seen as an ineluctable step towards eventual EU membership. And I think we should at least entertain the thought that from the Kremlin's view, Vilnius 2013 could look a lot like Bucharest 2008. Thank you.
Thank you, James. It was as brilliant as it was brief. Boris, you can analyze it from sort of perspective of a Russian who lives in Russia. And now, during Putin's first term, many people have suggested that as regime is less stable at home, behaves in a harsher manner, then that would also contribute to harsher foreign policy because external enemy figures are more needed. But at the same time, what do we see? I mean, James mentions subtle pressure. Here in Estonia, for example, Estonia probably has hardly ever had it as good with Russia as now. We are actually achieving something between us. So what's the logic of behavior?
Well, first of all, good morning. I'm no specialist in foreign policy of Russia, but I want to tell you that foreign policy, and I agree with James, is a continuation of domestic one. If you look what's happened inside, my understanding that this is transformation from so-called sovereign democracy, this conception based on falsification, on censorship, on nashisti, etc., to repression and to real dictatorship. This transformation started from May 6 last year. Now we have more political prisoners than in Belarus. And we look at typical double standards where there is sanction against Lukashenko and his team and no sanctions against Putin and his team. But if you look at the situation inside, dictatorship in Russia looks even sometimes more serious than in Belarus. For example, we have a law, anti-NGO law, about so-called foreign agents. I want to tell you that Lukashenko did not such kind of law. There is no such kind of law. Well, next point, what's happened inside is reduction of popularity of Putin. Not very quickly, step by step, but his popularity is going down, down. And the only way for him to keep power is to start a fight against enemies. Enemies inside and enemies outside. Well, his main goal is just to keep power forever and to steal. Keep and steal forever. I will prepare a report about upcoming Winter Olympic Games. This is the most expensive games in the world, with the cost 51 billion US dollars, well, which is more expensive than all of the Winter Olympic Games in the history of human, right? I want to tell you that his team, I mean Putin team, stole about 35 billion US dollars without any response from inside and outside. Well, that's why his main goal is keep power forever and steal forever. What about enemies? Who are the main enemies inside? First of all, opposition. That's why pressure to opposition is huge. We have more than 60 political prisoners now, and I'm afraid that an amount of prisoners will increase every month. Now we are looking for the beginning of so-called Bolotное дело prisoners, and this is very serious. I think that during the summer time, he will put them to the prison. Second is Navalny. You know that there are 5 cases against him. All of them are absolutely tricky, but he's afraid of him because he's one of the opposition anti-corruption leader. And his reports about, for example, Transneft, about Gazprom, about the government, etc., is very painful for this kleptocratia. Next is NGO. Of course, he hates independent individuals and independent organizations. The most serious for him is, for example, Transparency International. Transparency International is an organization which measures corruption inside not only Russia but in the world. And now this organization is a foreign agent, which in Russian language means foreign spy. Right? Next, association, Voice Association. This association is responsible for controlling of elections, and this is his real enemy. That's why the Voice is foreign agent too. Human rights organization. Majority of them, including famous Memorial, is a foreign agent. I'm foreign agent, of course. And Piankovsky and Delarionov, who are here, they're agent too. All of the opposition leaders, and not only leaders, activists, are agent, and difference is who am I, American, or Georgian, or Estonian, or Latvian. It doesn't matter for him, but all of us got money from the West or East and tried to destroy his system. Foreign policy, the most significant point. We do not have friends around. Putin has no friends around, just enemies or competitive countries. Of course, Baltic states are enemies because this is American spies. Lukashenko, he is enemy because he doesn't want to give him property in the country of Belarus, and he always get very cheap oil and gas, organize contraband, keep money, and do not split this money between Kremlin and Minsk. Yanukovych, of course, enemy. Problem of gas pipeline, problem of free trade zone, problem of who is closer, Moscow or Brussels. It gives a lot of tension. Kazakhstan, not enemy, but competitive country because of oil and gas. The same Azerbaijan. Maybe just one country look like friend. This is Armenia. Really, this is Armenia. Not because they like Putin, but because there is no choice for this country. Well, Georgia, I don't want to talk. Well, you understand. Well, Moldova, enemy. Moldova wants to be in the European Union. That's a disaster for Putin. Well, that's why, what kind of foreign policy? Enemies are around. Of course, the biggest enemy is the United States. That's why we must join around Kremlin, everybody, to fight against America. And his ally country like Baltics, like Poland, like Czech Republic, like Europe at all. Well, what is a situation? Of course, democracy, freedom, all of the things are our responsibility of Russian opposition, of Russian civil society. Of course, this is our work, this is our job. But if you look what's happened in Europe or even in the United States, what we have, for example, the US adopted Magnitsky list, right? The first names, 18 names, mean nothing, frankly, mean nothing. That's why even American administration close an eyes about what's happened in Russia, that this is dictatorship, and they think just about Syria, just about Afghanistan, about Iran, Israel, etc., but forget about general values. I think that maybe tactically this is good for Obama, but strategically this is disaster. This is real disaster. As far as Europe is concerned, this is even much more sad story. For example, Irish discussion about Magnitsky showed that they're so afraid of Putin's chantage that they forget about Magnitsky in 1 minute. Forget immediately. I don't want to talk what's happened in Germany or France or, of course, Italy and even the United Kingdom. But I don't know why the Westerners forget about values and are so afraid of him. What's happened?
But
why you are so afraid of him?
But let's ask. We have Eckart from Klaeden here. Why are you afraid? Why is Germany afraid?
First, we come to that. I just want to mention how moving it is for me to come to the Baltic states, and especially to Estonia. If you meet me here, you can't avoid getting told that my grandfather served in the Estonian cavalry after 1918, and my grandparents spoke often Estonian, especially when they talked about presents for their grandchildren. So we did not understand, but we appreciated very much when they were talking Estonian. And regarding the German policy on Russia, I would say Angela Merkel returned to the policies of the predecessors of Chancellor Schröder, and there are two key elements. One is, of course, that we are that we stick to our allies, that we are inevitable part of the West on the one side, and on the other side, from this clear fundament, we want to get as good relations to Russia as we can. And I would say there are three important fields to deal with Russia. The first is the economic and especially the energy field. There is in some areas improvement, but especially the shelf gas resources in the United States and the fracking capacities in the European Union, I think, changed the strategic landscape for Russia towards the European Union. For instance, the big German energy companies now negotiate with Gazprom on the basis of falling prices and not rising prices for natural gas, and this is, of course, a huge change in strategy. The second area is the neighborhood, and there Russia sees, in my view, more and more our common neighborhood not as an area for cooperation, but for competition. And all the organizations, Eurasian Union and others you both have mentioned, are a symbol for that. And the third area is Russia's behavior on the global stage. Here, there's also some cooperation, helpful cooperation. For instance, if we see Afghanistan, but also a lot or room for concerns regarding Syria, for instance, or Iran. And my impression is that I do agree with what you have said about the internal development in Russia. We all see this, the NGO law, all the other issues with great concern. And I do agree that the internal development in Russia always mirrors their foreign policy attitude. But nevertheless, we have to try to cooperate as much as we can with them. And I think the best way to deal with is a step-by-step approach. So I don't think that it is the time for a grand design, although we all would like to have a new agreement with Russia, but to try to cooperate on the different issues I have mentioned, and also some others with them, and also to face that in some fields, for instance, regarding Iran, we have common interests, but sometimes also different ones. And maybe my last point, I think that the Russian foreign policy is in serious matters not very coherent. If I see, for instance, the policy on Iran, and this is, of course, difficult to deal with, but then, of course, I think this kind of step-by-step approach is the best what we can do in this current situation.
I'm I've been following Germany's Russia policy to the extent I can, and I wonder, I mean, I can see that the tone of the debate in Germany has changed a lot now after Putin's comeback, and Bundestag adopted this very critical resolution on Russia. But I struggle to see, I mean, would you say, has it been translated into actual policies? Is Germany's policy vis-à-vis Russia somehow different from what it used to be? And if not, because step-by-step approach, I think was, earlier we used to have some maybe perceived big breakthroughs as well. But is there a feeling in Germany that we should do something more to address the domestic developments in Russia, and what would that be? Or
in the German public, I think the domestic development in Russia is lively discussed and seen, of course, with huge concerns. And I think the main difference is in the policy towards Russia, that there's no attitude any longer for a special relationship between Germany and Russia, or a special way or something like that. So, of course, our close ties, economic ties to Russia, I think, which are also helpful for our common Russian policy, are not longer a reason for exclusion of our policy, but they are bind into our common European policy. And so I would say this is the main difference. And of course, after the re-election of or whatever you call this, of President Putin.
Yeah.
This is good.
Of course. Of course, also the image has changed, and the pro-Putin voices are now more silent than they were the years before.
Thank you. We will come back to common European policy, but for now I want to bring in David Kramer. You have strong views about what America could and should have done and should do vis-à-vis Russia, but is not doing.
I do. Let me preface it by saying, having served all 8 years in the Bush administration, I don't think the Bush policy toward Russia was very good. We have been accused of having taken a finger-wagging, lecturing, patronizing approach toward Russia on human rights, and I wish that were true. I wish we were guilty of that. We did. And particularly with the arrest of Khodorkovsky and other things, we didn't push back enough, we didn't do enough. So let me start from there. My concern is the Obama administration is not only repeating the mistakes of the Bush administration, but has made them exponentially worse. And in March 2009, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post that warned that the reset policy might entail going silent on human rights, essentially ignoring the neighbors, and changing missile defense. And sadly, I'd say on all three, that's been proven right. The handling of the missile defense decision on September 17, 2009 was about as disastrous as one could sketch out. I don't know what US policy is toward the neighbors. I do know what US policy is toward Russia. I don't particularly like it, but I know what it is. I have no idea what US policy is toward the other countries in the region. And when it comes to human rights, President Obama went to Moscow, gave a very good speech in July 2009, met, I think, with you and others and civil society figures. Actually, a very good trip. I give him a lot of credit for that. He hasn't said a single thing about the human rights situation in Russia since then. And because of the investment of time that President Obama has put into the reset policy, at one point he had spoken with and met with Medvedev more than any other world leader. If the President of the United States doesn't say anything, then Putin doesn't take it seriously if it comes even from the Secretary of State. And that's why it does matter who says these things from Washington. And the deafening silence, I think, has essentially sent the bad signal to Moscow. I think also the reset policy has been founded on some fundamental misunderstandings and wrong assumptions. It started with a view that the administration could tip the balance in favor of Medvedev. And I would cite Obama's reference to Putin as having one foot in the Cold War right before he went to Moscow. Not the smartest thing to say. No. The second is the public and repeated rejection of the notion of linkage. This would not be the first US administration to not follow a policy of linkage, but it's the first administration to repeatedly and publicly reject the notion of linkage. And by doing that, you give Putin a green light to engage in whatever kind of misbehavior he wants to, because we're saying to him, there are no consequences, there are no costs, there are no penalties for cracking down on opposition in civil society. And then third, I would say, we thought anti-Americanism was an electoral fad. It was a passing phenomenon. Go back to 2004, Putin's speech after Beslan, talking about outside forces trying to grab chunks of Russia. 2007 Munich speech. 3 months later, comparing the United States to the Third Reich. And again, Bush administration didn't respond, in my view, aggressively enough to these. But it's just continued well beyond the election. And anti-Americanism, I agree completely with James, anti-Americanism is a tool and a vehicle to try to justify the way Putin governs inside the country. And we are the convenient scapegoat, the enemy, the target. And we don't push back, and when we don't push back, it only encourages this kind of behavior.
But isn't it so that there's such anti-American rhetoric? I agree, it's very convenient, but it's only possible for as long as the United States is still strong enough dominant force in the world. So if American strength declines, I think that will actually make things a lot less convenient for Russia. A couple of years ago here at Lennart Meri, we discussed a multipolar world. And someone said that in a multipolar world, make sure you're a pole. And Russia might not be it. So in a way, pretend to be weaker, pretend not to matter that much, and Russia might start worrying about American decline, the way it worries about America leaving Afghanistan.
But what I would say, Kadri, is that just look at what's happened in the past month, where you had Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, go to Moscow. You had John Kerry go to Moscow. You had Bibi Netanyahu to go to Moscow. You had David Cameron go to Moscow. Ban Ki-moon go to, maybe some went to Sochi. For the palace, yes, they had to see the palace.
Not in Olympics, fortunately.
No, they didn't go skiing. But the point is, everybody's going to see Putin. For what? What do they have to show for it? They have to show for it anti-ship missiles, advanced anti-ship missiles that have been transferred to Syria, boats deploying off the coast of Syria, And the disdain Putin holds the United States in is, I think, a major concern. He's laughing at us. He's laughing at all of us, frankly. He's sitting there watching all these leaders come to him when, frankly, I don't think he has much to deliver in the beginning. I don't quite understand this race to Russia to meet and shake hands with Putin when I don't think he can deliver for us. And not only is he not delivering, he's slapping us. He's ridiculing us. And, you know, just this statement, Patrushev was in Washington, sorry, I got to take off my glasses, was in Washington meeting with Tom Donilon. The president joined the meeting, and the White House issued this statement. President Obama joined National Security Advisor Tom Donilon's meeting today with Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev. The president expressed appreciation for President Putin's condolences and offer of assistance in the wake of the Oklahoma tornado. The president reaffirmed his desire to strengthen the bilateral relationship, including U.S.-Russian economic ties. They also discussed the importance of deepening counterterrorism cooperation and the need for a negotiated political settlement in Syria. The president noted he looked forward to seeing President Putin in June at the G8 summit. Really? In light of what's been going on, that's the best the White House can say? The NGOs are being kicked out. American NGOs are being kicked out. A former legal attaché from the U.S. Embassy was detained for 16, 17 hours without food and water at Sheremetyevo Airport the day Kerry arrived. They outed the CIA station chief. Kerry was kept waiting 3 hours, and he also was kept waiting at Sheremetyevo to go into Moscow.
Leave?
What's that?
Why didn't he just leave?
I don't represent him. You'd have to ask him. He should have. I mean, at a certain point, it becomes a bad joke.
Eckart, you also had thoughts about Russia and Syria and other issues. Do you agree with David that Russia doesn't have that much to deliver in the first place, and maybe we shouldn't make such a big effort? Maybe really we should see Russia as an end in itself and try to address Russia's domestic developments. You know, maybe long-term, Russian future is more important than the way the Syrian crisis gets resolved at this point. Maybe we should shift our priorities and really focus on Russia itself rather than seeing Russia as a means of achieving other things in the world.
Yeah, I think we have to do both. We have to address, of course, the domestic situation in Russia, but also in such a current crisis we see in Syria, we have to try, of course, to influence them or to bring them to a more constructive role regarding President Assad. So I don't see that difference.
James, you wanted to...
I fear we might be in danger of missing something. I do not believe that Putin, the circle around him, and much of the Russian elite are interested in our approval. To a large extent, they profit from our disapproval. They profit from defying us and getting away with it. And I think the knowledge of this has to stimulate on our part a very disciplined, objective discussion about what posture is sort of postures are effective and what are not. My own personal view, and I accept that I probably disagree with, probably a number of people in this room would disagree with me, is that the EU's third energy package have a far more important and profound effect on Russia than any number of Magnitsky acts, because it directly affects their ability to conduct business by their norms in our jurisdiction. I think it would be very useful if we took Putin at his word and said, fine, you're a sovereign country. Unlike Ukraine, you have no EU aspirations. You wish to be recognized as different and distinctive. Fine, you're different and distinctive. Then live with it. You do not then have a right to turn around and say, we belong de facto at the top table of the EU and NATO. You have no right to say that we should have a special relationship with institutions that define themselves on the basis of interests and values that we openly denounce and do not share. If these are your choices, live with the consequences. We haven't done that. The third energy package by the EU is the first serious attempt to do this, and it's getting them very worried. The big question is, I think we all know, whether we are going to have the backbone to follow through with it.
And I remember asking someone whom I consider a really smart analyst in European policy on what the EU's Russia policy should be. He said that, well, we should take care of our energy security and keep an eye on Ukraine. And that's basically it. Yesterday with Bobo, we discussed whether keeping an eye on Ukraine makes sense or not. And one might actually add taking care of Europeans' own anti-corruption legislation, making sure that our own house is clean and in order. But basically, it often seems that the best we can do on Russia is really taking care of ourselves and making us not complicit in Russia's policies. So I would want to bring in some actual foreign policy makers and ask Carl, you, what do you see a way for the EU to do something more than just addressing these issues that we should address anyway, Russia or no Russia? Please, can you bring the microphone?
I don't know. No, I mean, it is a somewhat difficult relationship between the European Union and Russia. First, from the Russia point of view, I think two things are sort of fairly obvious. First, they don't understand the European Union. I don't particularly blame them because they're not entirely alone in the world in that particular respect. And secondly, insofar as they understand it, they distinctly don't like it. Accordingly, we do see what I consider a very consistent policy by Moscow to undermine the EU in every single respect. Be that the effort to build a common foreign and security policy, which they don't like because that undermines different bilateral relationships, which are more easy for them to manage, or be that the competences that are there with the Commission. I mean, the third energy package, as well as the Commission antitrust case against Gazprom, are really sort of, that's the equivalent of nuclear war for them. Because we should not forget that Russia is a nation more dependent on export of fossil fuel than Saudi Arabia in terms of its economy. Mm-hmm. And most of that is to Europe, and most of that is gas. And these two things that are working independently from the Commission side are directed, or they see as directed. As a matter of fact, they aren't, because if these are properly implemented, they would be a substantial contribution to the true modernization of Russia. But that is not the way it's seen from the side of the Moscow leadership. What's our policy then? We have the tension in, I remember we used to have the debates when we have summits with Russia twice a year. We have summits with most of the world once a year, but with Russia twice a year for some sort of reason. And there's always this haggling over the communique. And the most entertaining aspect of it is the phrase common neighborhood, which the Russians distinctly dislike. We might consider Ukraine to be a common neighborhood of Russia and the European Union. They object to that phrase. It is not a common neighborhood, it's their neighborhood, not ours. And that reflects a somewhat fundamental disagreement on where we are. Eastern Partnership for a long time was something that they neglected because they thought it was nada. Not going to have any effect whatsoever. That's different now. They're beginning to be seriously concerned about the long-term impact of the Eastern Partnership. We might see it as a somewhat weak instrument sometimes. They see it as an increasingly strong instrument from their particular point of view. We are negotiating with them on the so-called NEO agreement. That's been going on for, I don't know, not quite forever, but 3-4 years or something like that, to replace the partnership and cooperation agreement signed in 1994. Those negotiations are going essentially nowhere. And the reason for that is not on our side, it's on their side. Because they say we are not really ready to go into a deeper economic relationship at the moment because we are so busy implementing the WTO, which they are not, by the way, but that's a separate issue. While we would be interested in deepening the economic relationship. Because fundamentally, we believe, I sometimes phrase it as the Ikea model for the development of Russia. That if you have the development of a broadly based middle class that are allowed to choose which bookshelf or sofa or whatever they want to have. Sooner or later they will demand other rights as well, beyond be able to choose at the Ikea store. And accordingly, we have an interest in development of a broad-based economic relationship, but that is dependent upon trade rules, rule of the law, and those other things. Then human rights, as David said. Important that I think we have a fairly high profile. We had human rights consultations the other day between the EU and Russia, and they didn't particularly like it. I mean, I think the Navalny trial is going to be the critical thing that we need to keep in focus. There was far more focus on the Pussy Riot, because that, from the media point of view, was a more sexy thing. But of course, the Navalny trial, I'm not going to neglect anything that happened there, but I mean, the Navalny trial is, of course, far more fundamental, because that's essentially political in every single sense. And they are up against an opponent that should not be neglected. Or not be sort of underestimated what he can do, because he's a fairly determined individual with a significant following and represents sort of a third generation in Russia that really want to do change. But we see, of course, increasing harassment. Well, harassment might be too far, but not far from it in terms of our diplomats and in terms of our observers. So I think we're heading for a somewhat more rocky period. And important from our point of view is to sort of build up the European Union, because that is long-term fundamental to managing this direct relationship versus them, who wants to have purely bilateral in order to play the one against the other.
Well, I think we are not in hopeless position. European Council on Foreign Relations produces this European foreign policy scorecard. And last year, Russia came out as a success story of European foreign policy. But it was a success story. I mean, how we create policies is we create unanimity, we create resources invested, and we create outcome. And on Russia, unanimity was very high. Europe really has common analysis of what's going on in Russia. Resources invested were so and so, outcome normally was close to zero. So, but I think having unanimity of analysis is actually a good starting point to develop common policy. But we are not there yet. Let's open for questions. Bobo, please. And I will, there are many questions, so I will collect at least three at a time, and then get back to you.
Thank you, Kadri. David, I think the reason, speaking for David Cameron, the reason he turned up in Sochi is there's a strong view within the British government that if they can only get Putin to play nice, then they can make some progress on Syria. Now, I think they're completely out to lunch. Absolutely. I think this is self-delusion on a grand scale, but that's what they believe, hence these kinds of moral and political compromises. Quickly, James, you speak about Vilnius 2013 possibly being like Bucharest 2008, which then raises the obvious question, how far could Putin go? So what do you see as a kind of end game, or even middle game? And Boris, you talked about enemies and competitors. Some years ago, you wrote Itogi, and you spoke a bit about China. What is China? Is China an enemy, a competitor, or something else? Because one idea is that it's a long-term enemy, but for at least the short to medium term, the case of my enemy's enemy is my friend, at least for the time being.
Thank you. Can you pass microphone to your neighbor? Yeah.
A terrific session. I'd like to ask how each of you sees the motivation behind Russia's recent air incursion in Sweden, and if Carl would feel free to say something, I obviously would be interested in that. I mean, I understand intimidation and I understand hatred of the West, but I mean, somebody in the Kremlin has to understand that there's going to be a pushback in public opinion. I mean, one thinks of NATO membership, possibly. It just seems to me to be, even given the paranoia, it just seems to me to be an extreme move, and I wonder if you could perhaps explain that to us.
Thank you. And please pass the microphone to Meri, just in front of you.
Thank you very much, Meri Mendras from Paris. My question to all of you is about the Syria conference in Geneva in June. My concern is really that it will start a useless process that might last quite some time and bury the issue. So I'd like to have your opinion. I mean, why are we doing it? I mean, for 2 years, we've been observing Putin and the Russian authorities as clearly saying that they will do nothing to stop the bloodshed. Why do we think today Russia can deliver? And if we remember the Iran case, there was not much that Russia delivered also on Iran. Thank you.
There's one more in your neighborhood, John Loft, just behind you.
John Luff, Chatham House. I have a question to Eckart von Klaeden about Germany's relations with Russia. And I don't wish to sound in any way politically incorrect. I'm a great admirer of the linkages Germany has built in Russia. Indeed, I spent 2 years, bizarrely, as somebody from Britain working at the German embassy in Moscow in the late 1990s. So I ask this question with some caution. I often hear German officials say, indeed as you did during your presentation, that we need to cooperate with Russia as much as possible. And I always find myself asking, why do you need to do it as much as possible? Why is it that you use this quantitative metric rather than a qualitative one? I mean, David Kramer talked about the question of linkage in US foreign policy towards Russia. Where is the conditionality? Where are the incentives in Germany's approach towards dealing with Russia? I always end up feeling that somehow Germany has maybe a lack of confidence about its ability to deal with Russia. And it's just easier to say, we should do as much as possible. That almost avoids making critical choices. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Cool. Eckart, let's start from you.
Yeah. First, maybe with Michael's question. I think this is the old Russian attitude to think that your own position is better if your neighbors are scared. And I also can't see any more sense behind that, because all the consequences you described couldn't be in their well-known interest, but nevertheless they have done this. Regarding the Syria conference, even if the expectations are not so high regarding Russians' behavior or Russians' contribution, I think it is good always to press them, to show that, to force them to explain their position on a public stage. And this, of course, I think Russia has to lose also something if they behave in that way, supporting President Assad. And as more it is public, I think it could be useful. So, and the last point, our position is, I think it is, if you see the importance of Russia as a P5 member and so on, I think it is useful and to invite Russia always to play a constructive role. On the other hand, we should not be naive and should not blame us for the Russian behavior. This is also clear. But try to find areas of cooperation, I think, is always a good approach. So it shows that our approach towards Russia is, or it is to reduce their ability to blame us for something, for being not constructive or something like that. So maybe I put it that way.
On the Syria concept, Meri, I agree completely. This is a way to stall for time to do nothing. It's a disaster. Lavrov has indicated he's going to insist that Iran be there. Obviously, that's a slight problem for the United States, or at least I hope it is. And there's not even going to be agreement on who's going to represent whom. Over 80,000 slaughtered in Syria, 5 million either internally displaced or refugees. Syria is a stain on the international community's record. I think there's no question about it. And this is just a way to buy more time to do nothing. So I have zero hopes for this conference. And I don't see why anyone should think that the Russians have suddenly seen the light and are going to be helpful in solving this. The anti-ship missile transfer and the deployment of the ships, I think, sends a loud enough signal about their views on this. On the issue about engagement and everything, look, I'm not opposed to working with Russia where we can, and we can get some things done. But my concern is the emphasis. And John, it's a lot like what you were saying, quantity over quality and focusing on what exactly it is we're doing. And the Obama administration right now just seems completely focused on the cooperative side of things and turning the other way on what's the worst crackdown in human rights in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's no doubt about it. By our measurements and our Freedom of the World rankings or any other measurements, through legislative means, through going after Navalny, going after people like you and civil society, this is an across-the-board attack against civil society, and we're just sticking our heads in the sand and saying and doing little about it. I take the point about consultations on human rights. I don't think the Russians take those very seriously. When we say, I'll stop with this, when we say something's unacceptable, then we have to do something about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we cheapen the currency. And I agree, James, with your point about the energy. I think you're absolutely right. But I do think Magnitsky at least shows that we're trying to do something about the human rights situation. And it would be so much better if Europeans adopted Magnitsky, because frankly, that's where Russians put their money and send their kids and travel and so on, not to the United States. But I take your point about energy, but Magnitsky is a direct consequence of the awful human rights situation in Russia. And it's frankly as much about us in the West as it is about Russia, so that, Kadri, your point, we're not legitimizing a rotten, corrupt, authoritarian regime.
Boris.
First, I agree with David as far as the role of Magnitsky list is concerned. Unfortunately, I don't know a European country who will be such brave and honest to discuss about Magnitsky.
But we're taking volunteers.
Yeah, good idea. Well, this is really very important. Maybe Estonia?
Tom's not here, so sure.
Well, but I want to answer a question concerning China, which Babo asked me. Well, China is a very special case, not only for Russia, but for the world, right? Second, China is a real threat for Russia. But Putin is so afraid of this country that he adopted and he signed an agreement about demilitarization of the border. Do you know that? About 200 miles, which is very strange because from one side of the border we have a population of 20 million of people. From another side we have more than 1 billion, right? But he signed it. Second, he gave Chinese government Russian land in Khabarovsky region and in Amur River, which is absolutely impossible to imagine that, for example, he did the same with Japanese Kuril Islands, for example. But he did with China. Third point, he signed very tricky and very fraught contract about oil, about 15 million tons of oil per year to China, with very secret contract. Navalny and me decided to get it, but nothing happened. Well, he's very afraid on one side, but he understands that we are not China is not a competitive country to Russia. He understands that. Chinese economy is maybe 5 or 6 times more than Russian economy, and GDP growing up is much higher. That's why, he understands that this is something different. Well, he still continues to sell weapons to China, and he still hopes that anti-American foreign policy is a common value. And this is a real way how to be together and forget about problems between two countries. But I think that energy problem and problem of depopulation of Siberia will lead to huge conflict in the future. But Putin still concentrate his military in Belarus, in Kaliningrad. The biggest enemy is NATO, like always. And nothing, no attention to what's happened in the eastern part of the country. Finally, Putin Russia will lose Siberia and Far East with such kind of policy. But if you look at rhetorics, he never mentioned China like a potential, even a potential threat. No sentence, no word, nothing.
James.
Bobo, thank you for your question. After Vilnius, if we sign association with Moldova or Ukraine or Georgia, will the Russians restage the Georgian war either there or someplace else? No. I will discipline myself for the sake of time and say nothing about Ukraine, but just look at Moldova. The Russians insist today that Moldova owes all of Transnistria's gas debt, which is twice what Ukraine theoretically owes. If they cut off that supply, are we thinking about that? Does the EU, the day after it signs the association agreement, have an answer to that? Is anyone thinking about that question? They have threatened to unilaterally increase the size of their military contingent in Pridnestrovia. They've said this already. They'll do it. They'll set up a consulate there. They said they would do it. They have started internally in Moldova reactivating the Gagauz and Bulgarian minority questions, and they will seek to destabilize the right bank. None of this involves troop movements and any of the sort of thing we saw in 2008. Who in the EU is thinking about it? So this is I just want to put all this on the table, and with Ukraine there's another equally ominous menu of things that can and possibly will be done. Thank you also for the question. I think this is a military-driven enterprise, of course with the necessary political approval, but one has to understand that even by the standards of the Strategic Air Command in the United States in the 1960s, the worst-case planning industry in the General Staff is at an ethereal level. There are two things they are worried about. First, in the broader strategic context, Medvedev himself defined the entire Arctic region as a zone of potential future conflict. And certain things followed militarily, mapping out a TVD. But secondly, if you look at the Russian military press, exercises, medium-sized and small, that have taken place in Poland have been interpreted on their side as rehearsing plans to cut off and blockade Kaliningrad. So in a Baltic context, I think they are now starting to go through the whole menu of responses to all that. That would be my hypothesis anyway.
Thank you. Let's take another round of questions. Andrei.
I have one observation and one question. Comment, Jamie, in your statement concerning the relative importance of this third package of the Energy Charter versus Magnitsky List. I think you're fundamentally incorrect. There is no more important stuff for Mr. Putin personally and his closest circle than Magnitsky list and all possible consequences. If you would compare a number of statements and number of actions, both domestically as well as externally, that have been done by the current Russian regime towards Magnitsky list, it's incomparable to this energy charter. As economist, I can tell you, this number of billions does not relevant too much for Mr. Putin at this moment compared to personal freedom for him and for his colleagues. And my question to you, Eckart, if I may, David was talking pretty soberly and honestly about the reset policy by the current administration, even by some kind of deficiencies over previous administration when he did serve. May I ask you about something that Kadri was talking a little bit about, successes in foreign policy in Germany. Could you tell us what you would consider as successes and achievements of the policies that you have explained as, if I'm not mistaken, step-by-step policy that is some kind of trying to convince or force Russian leaders to do something constructive? Could you please tell us what you have achieved, what kind of actions you would consider on the Russian side as constructive as a result of your efforts?
Thank you. The other Andrei. Yeah.
Thank you. All our four distinguished speakers made many important points about Russian foreign policy, but they try to understand and present it in a rational way, especially under Kadri questioning what is the logic of Kremlin. But to analyze Russian foreign policy, you should be inspired not by René Descartes, but by Fyodor Dostoevsky and Sigmund Freud. Because Kremlin leaders, their Dostoevsky character tormented by passions and by complexes mixture of inferiority and megalomania complex. The latest funny example is Minister Lavrov indignation of Great Russia humiliation on Eurovision song competition. It's behavior of banana state minister, not of the great power. All of them sincerely believe that Arab Spring, first, was inspired by and organized by Americans, as second, designed and directed against Russia and against them. And this irrational support of Assad, well, is explained very simply. He is one of us. For Putin, it's personal cooperative solidarity. I will be the next after Assad fall. But it's enough for Russian irrationality. But this irrationality is infecting. Western response is very irrational. I would say that Putin's personal relationship with his counterpart is the West is classical sadist masochist cooperation. David gave several examples of this. And let me just a couple of minutes to give, it seems, a very serious one more example. I happened to be in Washington immediately after Boston terrorist. And I was shocked when I watched on TV universal discourse, not only from Obama administration research architects, but even on conservative talk show. Well, forget about Magnitsky, we committed mistake. We need Putin only for one thing, to cooperate in the fight with international terrorism. Putin making condolences, he promised cooperation. He is protecting us, we should protect Americans. Only on this agenda we should cooperate with Putin and never irritate him by anything else. And a month has passed, but nobody raised a very important question about this terrorist Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who was in all Russian database since 2011. But in 2012, he arrived safely in Sheremetyevo, spent 8 months in Moscow and then Dagestan, interacted there with well-known Islamists, including his American friend Plotnikov. 2 of them were liquidated by Russian special forces, but Mr. Tsarnaev was not apprehended, interrogated, and arrested, and safely sent back to the United States.
Thank you, Andrei. Let's take more questions. Terry, whoever, please.
Thank you. Terry Schultz. I'm a journalist covering the EU and NATO for National Public Radio and CBS News. And part of my question was now already taken to Minister van Klaeden about the Germany's foreign policy successes, but also to Kadri. Why should the European Union be proud of unanimity on its Russia policy when, as we see so many times, you get down to the lowest common denominator, everybody agrees, yeah, we're doing enough. And I'm really disappointed to hear Estonia and Poland, for example, are not fighting back as we once would have expected them to do. And so since you've already been asked, Minister van Klaeden, about your foreign policy, about the successes of your Russia policy, I would like to hear your thoughts on how the US is handling it, especially when we're hearing that even after the Magnitsky Act, David Kramer says this is a failure in policy, it's a green light to Moscow. Does Germany think the US is doing enough? Thanks.
Thank you. So there was a question. Per Carlson, please. Yeah.
No, over there.
Oh, give to. I mean, Alan Riley is closer to. Yeah, and then Per.
So, Alan Riley, City University. I just wanted to follow up. Mentioned about the third energy package. Carl mentioned about the antitrust case brought by the European Commission. One of my, I'd like to know about the kind of foreign policy impact of this with the Russians. I mean, I'm not sure a lot of foreign policy experts entirely understand what has now been put in place with the DG Competition's prosecution. I mean, this is rolling forward. If the allegations, which are very serious in breach of the European Union competition rules, prove to be correct and the Commission has the evidence, we will have a prohibition decision. To start with, the market cap of Gazprom is about $100 billion. The Commission's maximum fine could be $10 billion. And we would think, okay, normally for a serious offense, you pay 3 to 4% of turnover, so $3 to $4 billion. They have 2 months to pay it. If they don't pay it, the Commission can execute against any Gazprom state-owned assets within the European Union. There's a possibility that one of the major allegations revolves around Gazprom's ownership of pipeline networks or control of pipeline networks across Europe, and therefore part of the decision could well be an order to sell those pipeline networks. Now, if you have those sort of orders, in addition to the prospect of them being told that indexation of gas prices to oil is unlawful, and therefore, for example, Poland and Estonia can obtain actual damages against Gazprom for overcharges and overpayments back to 2004 with interest. Now, this is actually serious, potential, legal consequences of a Commission prohibition decision. And the question I put over to you, gentlemen, is what is going to be the Russian foreign policy, overall political reaction to these legal realities, these legal blows as they come down from Brussels? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Per, and then gentleman behind you.
Boris, I have other good Russian friends who have given up to wait for support from the US and Europe, and they are now talking about the only solution being the economical decline in Russia, which should bring down Putin at some stage. Do you agree with that? And if you do, how do you see that scenario? Long term, short term? How do you see it?
Please pass microphone just behind you.
Yeah, thank you. Michael Köhler, European Commission. I mean, James, you questioned whether anybody was thinking in Brussels about Moldova and all the activity there. And the good news, yes, Brussels is still alive and kicking. I mean, if, for example, last year, for the first time, Poland got gas supplies from Germany, if this year, Ukraine, for the first time, got gas supplies from Poland, initially from Germany. If it is possible in future to cover the entire Ukrainian need of gas from the west and no longer from the east, and if this year we are going to start or see the start of construction works of a Moldova-Romania gas interconnector, very largely financed by EU money, all this doesn't come from nowhere. All this is something which has to do with the strategy in response to certain policy challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a question back there. Back corner, and then Ian Brzezinski will be the last one. I'm sorry, we have no time for those who thought about it later. Please.
Well, I'm Peter Balas from the European Commission, DG Trade, and supervising the economic relations was with Russia and the eastern neighborhood. My question is the following, that we hear these very strong reactions from Russia on the planned signing of the association agreements and DCFTAs. However, there is a major difference between signing an agreement like that, which is not an exclusive relationship, which allows all these countries to maintain their free trade relations with the Russia and other CIS countries, in contrast with joining the customs union, which is an exclusive and monopolistic relationship. So I think that this kind of perhaps somewhat overblown reaction, it's more for propaganda than for reality, but would be interested in your views. Thanks.
Thank you. And Ian.
Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. Each one of our panelists come from a country that is sitting on the G8. And I'd be interested in your advice. Put yourselves in the shoes advising non-Russian governments in the G8. So Mr. Nemtsov can contribute to this. What should they do? What should they communicate? What steps should they take? How can they leverage this meeting in which Putin will be participating to push a new, more realistic policy along the lines you've been advocating towards Russia?
Thank you. Lots of questions. That's not an excuse to avoid the difficult ones. Eckart, shall we start with you? The successes of Germany's step-by-step policy and other things.
I think there are some areas of cooperation. For instance, fighting piracy, common approach regarding drug trafficking. But for us, I would say the most important thing is the transit of our troops regarding the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, but you're right, of course, there should be more, but the other question is, what is the alternative to this approach? I just want to give you a short idea on the debate in Germany on the Russia policy. And in the last years, there were some prominent advocates in Germany saying that the Russian behavior is just the consequence of neglecting and rejecting Russia's offers. You all know these arguments, breaking promises we gave to Russia in the 90s and all these things. And I think this debate is also, this debate also happens in our common neighborhood. If Russia, for instance, tries to increase her influence, and having this constructive approach always forces Russia to make a decision, and collecting all these results or even failures of these attempts gives us more arguments for a more realistic approach towards Russia. So even if this approach fails in this or that issue, I think it has its value for arguing the debate how to deal with Russia.
Thank you. Other speakers, questions and any final thoughts you may have. We are nearing the end.
Well, one question about the role of G8. I think that Putin needs G8 just for legitimization of his power. That's it. Well, and continuation of G8 or G20 doesn't matter, not for solving some questions concerning Syria or Iran, but just to show that I'm one of the most powerful leaders in the world. I'm like Obama, I'm like, you know, everybody, Cameron, Merkel, etc. And yes, we are the great country, but I'm a great leader. That's it. Nothing will happen on this summit, nothing. Just to help him to keep power forever. That's why my understanding is to look more attentively of the role of Putin Russia inside this quite important organization. And second question concerning Gazprom. I was a Minister of Energy many, many years ago and was responsible for Gazprom. First point, Gazprom is a business of Putin. He controls everything inside Gazprom, everything. Management, cash flow, pipeline construction, everything. Second, he proceeds completely stupid policy concerning export of gas. Completely stupid, idiotic policy. Russia lost European market. Every year, not dramatically, but 5%, 10% every year. Because prices, this is so-called policy of long-term contracts, and prices for gas are higher than in the spot market. That's why continuation of such kind of policy will lead to reduction of role of Gazprom. Of course, competition inside shale gas, maybe in the future export of gas from the States to Europe, etc. And diversification here will give no chance for Putin Gazprom to control real European market. The only way for Russia is, first of all, demonopolization of gas market inside and outside the country, and change prices, stupid prices policy. Well, new rules in Europe, of course, will press him and give him opportunity to change his price policy. Well, and for him, this is very painful because this is his business. Of course, if you will come to the court and discuss what's happened inside, penalty, $3–4 billion, etc., this is his money. That's why he will be very, very cautious and maybe change policy.
Thank you. David.
Just a few very quick points, picking up on Andrei's point on the bombings and how some people have said this is a reminder of how we have to work together with Russia on combating terrorism. The Russian response has been rather odd, to say the least, with the handling of the Ryan Fogel case and the outing of the CIA station chief. That's not exactly a way to signal to Washington that we're interested in working together. We also have fundamentally different definitions of what terrorism is. And I don't see how we can reconcile those. On the G8, I agree with Boris. I would focus more on Council of Europe and OSCE, which have rules that Russia is not complying with already. And G8 is supposed to be a group of industrialized democracies, and I would hope that people would not forget the word democracies in that. But the Council of Europe is a place where I think we can and should, well, not the United States, but can be holding Russia more to account. Let me just say very quickly that there have been some positive outcomes of the reset policy. I don't mean to paint an entirely bleak picture. The Northern Distribution Network, though of course we do pay Russia for use of Russian territory. The Iran resolution, but there hasn't been any since then. We also got 3 resolutions passed in the Bush administration on Iran, let's not forget. The New START agreement, although we came across wanting and needing that more than Russia did, and Russia actually didn't have to cut anything. WTO, which I would argue wouldn't have happened had it not been for Georgia and Georgia's efforts to strike a deal. So there are some positives, but the problem at the end of the day is the nature of the regime. And it's the nature of the regime that poses the challenge, and I would even use the word threat to us, threat to our interests and threat to our values, that we cannot stay neutral to it.
James.
I will be very self-disciplined and respond selectively to 3 questions. Andrei Ilarionov, I wish I could agree with you. I can't. I see no realistic chance at all that the West will extend Magnitsky-like prohibitions to Putin or to anyone who matters profoundly to him. The only occasions in which the West successfully played the internal card against Russia paradoxically arose during the Cold War, and these policies were effective because their aims were limited. Russia was at the center of our strategic attention. We understood the risks. We were ready to accept them. I do not think we are structurally capable today of pursuing such a policy effectively, and if we can only pursue it rhetorically, then we have to ask who it's helping. Alan Riley, thank you for your question. I do see signs that the leadership is putting together a multi-dimensional strategic counteroffensive to the third energy package. I do not think it will succeed. We can discuss the details in the corridor. I think it will be another example of Russia's talent at responding to issues that matter, achieving lose-lose outcomes. And that is the risk, but I think we need to know they are reacting. And finally, Andrei Pionkovsky, thank you for raising this psychological dimension. We are, again, a lot of us are at risk of forgetting Russia is a very egotistical, very proud, and very resentful power. And I do not simply mean Putin. There's too much of a focus on him. I mean the preponderance of the governing class, which by definition means also a large proportion of business interests, and unpopular as it is to say so, a large proportion of Russian society as well. Navalny's name has been mentioned several times. I think it's important to note that as strong and effective a critic he is of the corruption embedded in the system, he is also a supporter of ethno-Russian nationalism, which Putin is not. And he is also a firm supporter in the Western former Soviet states of creating a Slavic Union. And his comment to Ukrainians who spoke to, who objected to this was, now as in the past, little people have to defer to big people. I don't think we should assume that all alternatives to Putin are necessarily going to be better. I think the problem is more serious and longer term than that. Thanks.
Thank you. And there was one question addressed to me on why I consider unanimity a good thing. Unanimity of analysis. A couple of years ago, we still had situations when the European Union was discussing, say, human rights situation in Russia. Some countries' diplomats came to the table with explicit instructions to have President Medvedev mentioned in the first sentence in positive context. And there were so many vested interests, personal relationships, and simple incompetence that obscured the discussion. I think now at least we are having honest discussion and hopefully asking the right questions, and I see that already as a progress. And I hope we have managed to raise at least some right questions at this session as well. Maybe not, maybe we don't have yet all the good answers, but we will convene again next year on Russia. But here, things will continue. Join me in thanking our speakers.